Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Forbidden Camp.
I still remember that day vividly, as if it were etched into my mind like a haunting melody. It was late summer, and my friends and I were itching for an adventure. We were young, reckless, and ready to explore the unknown. So, when Jake suggested we camp in the remote Blackwood forest, I should have listened to my gut. Instead, I went along with the plan, swept up in the thrill of it all. As we gathered in Jake's living room, excitement crackled in the air. "You guys know about the disappearances in Blackwood, right?" I asked, trying to gauge their reaction. The tales had circulated through our town for years. People who ventured too deep into the woods, only to vanish without a trace. "Oh, come on. Those are just urban legends," Emma chimed in, rolling her eyes. "We're not scared of a few ghost stories. This is going to be epic." Jake grinned, clearly undeterred by my warning. "Exactly. It's just camping. We'll stick together, have a great time, and tell ghost stories around the fire. What could go wrong?" I wanted to believe that, too. As the day approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were inviting trouble. The locals had warned us to steer clear of Blackwood, but their stories only fueled our curiosity. After all, nothing exciting ever happened in our quiet town. When we finally set off, the sun was high in the sky, bathing the landscape in warm light. The drive to the forest was filled with laughter and music, but as we got closer, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew taller, the road narrower, and an eerie silence enveloped us. I glanced at the others, their excited chatter fading as the gravity of our destination sunk in. "Here we are," Jake announced, pulling into a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The campsite felt isolated, a world away from the hustle and bustle we were used to. We unloaded the car, the excitement bubbling back up as we set up our tents. But as I unpacked, I noticed something unsettling. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, like the forest itself was watching us. That evening, we gathered around a crackling campfire, the warmth momentarily dispelling my unease. Shadows danced around us as the sun dipped below the horizon, and we began swapping stories. I tried to keep my voice light, but the legends of Blackwood crept into my mind, haunting me. I shared a few tales, hoping to lighten the mood, but I could see the nervous glances exchanged among my friends. As darkness descended, the forest came alive. Strange sounds filled the night, rustling leaves, distant twigs snapping, and an almost imperceptible whisper that sent chills down my spine. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or the wildlife. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. "Are you guys hearing that?" I asked, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "Hear what?" Jake replied, poking the fire with a stick. "It's just the woods being creepy. Nothing to worry about." But I wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like a ghostly thread. I tried to enjoy the camaraderie, but I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. It was just a camping trip, right? What could possibly go wrong? Little did I know, we had crossed a line into a realm that should have been left undisturbed, a place where dark secrets lingered and ancient eyes watched from the shadows. Night had fully enveloped the forest by the time we finished dinner, and the crackling campfire became our only source of warmth against the encroaching chill. The shadows cast by the flames danced like phantoms around us, and I found myself stealing glances into the darkness beyond the glow. It felt as if the trees were whispering secrets among themselves, their branches swaying as though beckoning us to listen. "Hey, who's up for ghost stories?" Jake suggested, a mischievous glint in his eyes. I could feel my heart race at the thought. The last thing I wanted was to delve into the very legends that had me on edge. But as the bravado in the group surged, I forced a smile and nodded, trying to join in on the fun. As we shared our tales, I felt the atmosphere shift. Jake recounted the story of a group of campers who vanished without a trace, their screams swallowed by the forest. Emma told of a hiker who had stumbled upon an ancient altar deep in the woods, never to be seen again. Each story added weight to my anxiety, and the laughter that once echoed around the campfire began to fade, replaced by nervous chuckles and uneasy glances. "Let's just go to bed," I suggested after a while, my voice barely above a whisper. The urge to retreat to the safety of my tent was growing stronger. But as we each settled into our sleeping bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there, staring at the tent's fabric, the sounds of the forest echoing outside. The rustling leaves seemed to grow louder, accompanied by a faint whispering that crawled under my skin. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as the minutes stretched on, I realized sleep wouldn't come easily. Then I heard it. A soft voice, barely discernible, fluttered through the night air. I strained to listen, but it was too quiet, too distant to make out. Was it the wind? Or something more sinister? I glanced at my friends, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the creeping dread that had settled over me. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and listened intently. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and in the heavy silence, the forest felt alive, as if it had been holding its breath. My friends stirred, but no one spoke. We all felt it, the tension hanging in the air, a weight that made it hard to breathe. "What was that?" Emma finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my pulse racing. "It's probably just an animal." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. The sound had been too loud, too deliberate. I could feel the eyes of the forest upon us, watching, waiting. The hours dragged on. I finally managed to close my eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the forest. Just as I began to drift off, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and right outside our camp. My heart dropped, and I sat up, frozen in place. "Guys," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But no one answered. The footsteps continued, circling our campsite, each step growing closer. I wanted to call out, to wake my friends, but a primal instinct held me back. It felt like whatever was out there didn't want to be discovered. I could feel a chill creeping into my bones, a sense of dread that coiled around my throat. Then I heard it again, the whispering. It was closer now, as if whatever was lurking in the shadows was right beside us, hiding just out of sight. The forest seemed to hum with energy, and I knew we were being watched. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whatever was out there would go away, that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But as I lay there, listening to the footsteps and the whispering, I felt a sickening realization wash over me. We were not alone in these woods, and something was coming for us. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing sleep to come, but it eluded me like a distant memory. The whispers and footsteps were relentless, circling our campsite, taunting me with their proximity. Just when I thought I might scream out, the sounds would fade, only to return again, closer and more insistent. Finally, As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I felt a semblance of relief. The whispers had receded, and the forest was eerily quiet. I glanced around the tent, relieved to see that my friends were still there, their faces peaceful in sleep. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "Guys, wake up. It's morning," I said, nudging Jake, who groaned in response. After a few more nudges and grumbles, everyone slowly emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and stretching as if waking from a deep slumber. "What a night," I muttered, forcing a laugh. "Did anyone else hear those noises?" "Stop it," Emma said, rolling her eyes. "You were just scared from all the stories last night." But I noticed the way her eyes darted to the tree-line, a flicker of unease crossing her face. After breakfast, we decided to explore the area, hoping to shake off the fear of the previous night. As we wandered through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking behind the trees. We hiked for a couple of hours, taking in the beauty of the woods, but the atmosphere remained heavy, and I felt like the air was thick with an unspoken tension. When we returned to the campsite, we decided to rest for a moment before lunch. That's when we noticed it. Kevin was missing. "Has anyone seen him?" I asked, my stomach sinking. We had all been together just an hour ago, but now he was gone, and a sense of panic began to creep in. "No, I thought he was right behind us," Jake replied, a frown etched on his face. We called out for Kevin, but our voices echoed back with nothing but silence. The woods seemed to close in around us, suffocating in their stillness. "Maybe he went for a walk," Emma suggested, but her voice wavered, betraying her own fear. "Or maybe he's just messing with us," Jake added, trying to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. I could see the worry in their eyes as they exchanged glances. We decided to split up and search for him, each of us venturing deeper into the woods, calling his name. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I walked further away from the campsite, the trees closing in around me. The whispers returned, more distinct now, swirling around me like a dark cloud. I strained to listen, hoping to hear Kevin's voice, but all I caught were echoes, laughter that felt out of place, and a chill that wrapped itself around my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It was quiet here, too quiet, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked around, but there was no sign of Kevin. Just as I turned to head back, something caught my eye, something glimmering in the underbrush. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. It was Kevin's backpack. My breath hitched in my throat as I knelt down, fear rising within me. The pack was untouched, and my gut twisted in a sickening way. "Kevin!" I called again, panic flooding my voice. I turned to head back to the campsite, but as I did, I heard it. The whispers intensified, forming a chorus of chilling tones that seemed to call my name. I felt the ground shift beneath me, and instinctively, I quickened my pace, the whispers growing louder, urging me to stop, to listen. "Kevin!" I yelled again, desperation creeping into my voice. But the only response was the eerie silence of the forest, wrapping around me like a shroud. When I finally reached the campsite, I saw Jake and Emma standing there, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. "Did you find him?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "No, but I found his backpack," I replied, my heart racing. "Something's not right. We need to leave." But as I spoke those words, the whispers erupted into a cacophony, echoing through the trees, and I felt a chill in the air. It was as if the forest itself was warning us that we were in grave danger. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and I could feel the weight of something dark pressing in on us. We were being hunted, and we had only just begun to realize the true horror that awaited us in this forbidden camp. Panic settled in my chest like a lead weight. I could see the fear etched on Jake and Emma's faces as I recounted what I had found. The backpack, Kevin's disappearance, and those whispers, they were all connected. Something dark lurked in this forest, and it was no longer just a myth or a ghost story. It was real, and it was hunting us. "Okay, we need to pack up and get out of here," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of fear raging inside me. "We can't stay another minute." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "What if we find Kevin? He could be lost out there." "We'll call for him on the way back to the car," I reassured her, though the words felt hollow. I knew deep down that something was very wrong, and if we lingered, it might be too late for all of us. We hurriedly packed our things, each rustle of fabric and clinking of gear amplified by the oppressive silence of the forest. I felt eyes watching us, hidden among the shadows of the trees, and each glance over my shoulder sent chills crawling up my spine. As we started down the trail, I tried to ignore the whispers that seemed to follow us, curling around my ears like ghostly fingers. They were just echoes of my imagination, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But every time the breeze rustled through the branches, I felt a tightening grip around my heart. "Do you think we'll really find him?" Jake asked, breaking the heavy silence. I hesitated, glancing back toward the campsite, which now seemed like a tomb, a resting place for all the horrors that had taken place there. "I hope so," I finally replied, my voice barely above a whisper. As we trekked deeper into the woods, the sunlight began to fade, the trees standing taller and darker, looming over us like ancient sentinels. The air turned cooler, and I could feel the shadows lengthening, as if they were swallowing the light whole. "We need to pick up the pace," Emma urged, her breath coming in quick bursts. I could see the fear in her eyes mirrored in Jake's. Suddenly, the whispers erupted into a cacophony, rising and falling like a haunting melody that seemed to come from all directions. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. "Can you hear that?" I asked, looking back at them, my heart racing. They nodded, fear written all over their faces. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "It's not just in your head," Emma whispered, her gaze darting around as if expecting something to leap out at us. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, my instincts screaming at me to run. I pushed forward, leading them down the path, but the whispers grew louder, wrapping around us, drowning out our thoughts. It was as if the forest was alive, feeding off our fear, growing stronger with every step we took. Then, as we rounded a bend, we came to a clearing, an open space surrounded by trees. In the center stood a massive stone structure, partially obscured by vines and underbrush. My heart dropped. It looked like an old, crumbling altar. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, staring wide-eyed at the unsettling sight. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a dark curiosity mixing with my terror. "Let's get out of here," I said quickly, but something in the back of my mind urged me to step closer, to investigate. Before I could protest any further, Emma broke away from the path and approached the structure. "Guys, look!" she called out, crouching near a carving on the stone. "Stay back!" I shouted, but my voice was lost in the rising storm of whispers. Jake hesitated, torn between his instinct to follow Emma and his fear of what lay ahead. "Emma, come back!" he shouted, but she didn't seem to hear him. I watched, horrified, as she traced her fingers along the carvings. They were grotesque images, faces twisted in agony, figures writhing as if trapped in eternal torment. "It's like a warning," she murmured, entranced. "Emma, don't!" I screamed, but it was too late. The moment her fingers made contact, the whispers surged into a deafening roar. The ground beneath us trembled, and I felt a darkness seep into my bones, a suffocating dread that clawed at my mind. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, a silhouette that seemed to melt into the darkness. I felt my heart stop. It was too tall, too distorted, and as it stepped forward, the whispers grew into a frenzy, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that shrieked in terror. "Run!" I screamed, pulling Jake back as we stumbled away from the altar. I glanced back at Emma, who was now frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear, mouth moving as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. We fled, hearts pounding, but the whispers followed us, a sinister chorus promising that something ancient and malevolent was hunting us. I felt a sense of urgency as we dashed through the trees, desperate to escape the nightmare that had consumed our camping trip. In that moment, I knew we were not just running from whatever haunted this place. We were running from the darkness within ourselves, and I could only pray it wouldn't catch us before we found a way out. The forest was a blur of shadows and flickering lights as we sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at my skin like the fingers of the damned. I could hear Jake and Emma behind me, their breaths heavy with fear. We had to get away, had to escape whatever malevolent force was hunting us. But as we pushed deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, twisting around us like a living entity. I could feel their icy fingers wrapping around my throat, constricting my thoughts, drowning out any hope of clarity. "We need to find a way back," I shouted, but my voice felt small, lost in the chaos of the night. "Over there," Jake yelled, pointing to a faint path that wound between the trees. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, but I could see it, the glimmer of safety beckoning us. We took off down the path, but it felt like we were running in circles, the trees closing in around us, trapping us in their suffocating grip. I could see the terror etched on Emma's face as she stumbled behind us, her footsteps faltering. "Keep going. We can't stop," I urged, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. Suddenly, I heard it, a chilling laugh that echoed through the trees, resonating with a twisted glee. My blood ran cold. It was a sound that spoke of ancient cruelty, of unspeakable horrors that thrived in the darkness. "We're not alone," Emma screamed, her eyes wide with terror as she glanced back. "It's right behind us." I could feel the heat of panic rising in my chest, a primal instinct urging me to turn and face whatever nightmare pursued us. "Just run," I yelled, desperation creeping into my voice. But it was too late. The shadows morphed, taking shape before my eyes, coalescing into a figure that towered over us. It was grotesque, with eyes like black pits and a mouth twisted into a ghastly grin. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as it took a step forward, its presence suffocating. "Leave us alone," I shouted, but my voice cracked. "Why do you run?" the creature hissed, its voice a sibilant whisper that slithered into my ears. "You've awakened us. You belong here now." The ground beneath us trembled as if responding to its words, and I felt the pull of despair creeping into my heart. "No, we're leaving," I shouted defiantly, pushing past my fear. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I grabbed Jake and Emma, pulling them toward the path that seemed to shimmer faintly in the distance. "We have to break free from its hold," I cried, desperation fueling my every step. As we ran, The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices pleading for release. I could feel their anguish, the weight of their despair pressing down on me like a leaden shroud. "We're not like you," I screamed back into the void. "We won't be trapped here." But the figure was relentless, following us with an ease that chilled me to the bone. I could sense its presence growing closer, the darkness wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. "You cannot escape," it taunted, laughter echoing through the night. "Faster," I urged, my heart pounding as we reached the edge of the clearing where the ancient altar stood, looming over us like a silent sentinel of death. We skidded to a halt, panting and gasping for breath, the moonlight casting eerie shadows around us. "Do we go back?" Jake asked, panic creeping into his voice. "No, we can't," I replied, desperately scanning the area for anything that might help us. "That altar, maybe it was our way out. We have to confront it. It's the only way." With a surge of resolve, I stepped toward the altar, my heart racing. The creature loomed behind us, its presence suffocating, but I couldn't let it win. I needed to reclaim my strength, to fight back against the darkness that threatened to swallow us whole. I raised my voice, echoing the anguish of the spirits trapped within the forest. "We are not yours," I yelled, summoning every ounce of courage within me. "You don't own us. We choose to leave." The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned, its laughter faltering. "You think you can defy the Ancient Ones?" it hissed, its eyes narrowing. But I stood firm, pulling Jake and Emma close. "We will break the cycle. We will be free." The air around us shimmered as if the very fabric of reality was bending to our will. The whispers surged into a roar, and the shadows twisted and writhed, battling against the creature's hold. "Run!" I shouted, and we turned, racing toward the path leading out of the clearing. As we ran, the whispers became a crescendo, a cacophony of voices rising up, drowning out the darkness. I could feel the energy shifting, the oppressive weight lifting as we broke free from the creature's grasp. We sprinted down the path, the moonlight guiding us, and with each step, the forest began to fade, the oppressive shadows retreating into the depths. Finally, we burst into a clearing, the trees giving way to the open road where our car sat waiting in the distance. I turned back, catching one last glimpse of the forest, dark and brooding, the whispers fading into silence. "We did it," I breathed, my heart racing with exhilaration and relief. "Let's never come back," Jake said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "Agreed," I replied, and we hurried toward the car, feeling the weight of the night lifting. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the forest receding into the distance. I knew that its darkness would linger, that its whispers would haunt my dreams. But for now, we had escaped. We had faced the shadows, and we were free.
The Abandoned Hostel.
I arrived in Millfield as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets. My legs ached from the long hike, and all I could think about was finding a place to rest. The town felt like it had been forgotten by time, with an air of stillness that sent shivers down my spine. The only option was a run-down hostel, its sign swinging slightly in the wind, creaking like it was trying to warn me away. With a heavy sigh, I pushed open the door, the hinges protesting loudly. The interior was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners of the room. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, and the air smelled stale. An elderly woman sat behind the front desk, her gaze glued to a book that looked older than I was. When I approached, she barely looked up. "Just one night," she croaked, her voice rough, like gravel underfoot. I nodded, handing her a few crumpled bills. She handed me a tarnished key with the number 7 etched on it, barely making eye contact. "Upstairs," she said, pointing vaguely. I felt a chill as I took the key, an odd sense of foreboding creeping over me. The staircase groaned under my weight as I ascended. The second floor was quiet, the silence almost oppressive. I glanced around, noticing that the hallway was lined with doors, each one closed, hiding whatever secrets lay beyond. When I reached my room, I opened the door and stepped inside. The bed looked unmade, as if it hadn't been touched in weeks. I dropped my backpack and took a moment to gather my thoughts. As darkness fell, the shadows in the room began to stretch, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue. After all, it was just a hostel. Nothing to fear, right? But deep down, a whisper of doubt lingered, gnawing at my mind. As I lay in bed, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, the oppressive silence settling around me like a heavy fog. Little did I know that my night was just beginning, and the darkness held secrets far more sinister than I could ever imagine. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was suffocating, and it felt like the walls were closing in around me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, rolling over in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. It was then that I heard it, a faint tapping sound echoing through the hall, rhythmic and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat up, straining to listen. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, almost distant whispering. I could have sworn I heard my name. No, I thought, dismissing it as a trick of my imagination. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, heart racing, and reached for my flashlight. Creeping out of my room, I stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The light danced along the walls, revealing faded wallpaper and the occasional glimpse of dust particles swirling in the air. I walked slowly, drawn toward the source of the noise. As I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the end of the hall. My heart raced. Was I seeing things? The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing there, frozen in fear. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the echo of my own words. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. Why was I being such a coward? I turned back toward my room, but as I did, I heard it again, the whispering, closer this time. "Help us." The words sent chills down my spine. Who was asking for help? My curiosity wrestled with my instinct to flee. I took a deep breath and moved forward, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I had to know what was happening, and I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. As I approached the door at the end of the hall, a cold draft swept through, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a chilling wind. I pushed the door open, and what I found inside would change everything. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing a room cloaked in darkness. My flashlight beam flickered across the walls, illuminating old furniture covered in white sheets that looked like ghostly figures waiting in the shadows. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew hung heavily, making it difficult to breathe. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I scanned the room, my light fell on a dusty mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was marred, but I could still make out my reflection, looking pale and wide-eyed. I took a step closer, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something shift behind me in the darkness. I whirled around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Then, I noticed a small door in the corner of the room, slightly ajar. The whispers were louder now, almost pleading. "Help us, please," they echoed in my mind, a chorus of lost souls trapped in this place. I felt an unexplainable pull toward the door, a mix of fear and curiosity driving me forward. I hesitated for a moment, then grasped the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a jolt of fear through me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was smaller, with walls lined with photographs, all of them old and faded. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the faces. They were the same as the ones I had seen in the hostel's common area. Each photo captured a moment in time, a memory of happiness long gone. But there was something more sinister. The last photograph showed a group of smiling travelers, arms slung around each other, standing in front of the very hostel I was in. Beneath it, a date was scrawled in shaky handwriting, June 12, 1987. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized these people were never seen again. My heart raced as I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic set in as I rattled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a cacophony of sorrow. "Join us! Join us!" The walls seemed to close in, and I could feel the cold creeping around me, suffocating. Desperation took hold, and I pounded on the door, screaming for help. But all I heard in return was the echo of my own voice, lost in the abyss of the haunted hostel. I sank to the floor, realizing that whatever was in this place didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to become part of its dark history. I huddled against the wall, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, pressing against my ears like a storm. "Join us! You're one of us now." The voice was soft yet insistent, filling my mind with a sense of dread I had never known before. I felt as if the very walls of the room were alive, closing in around me. In a frenzy, I scrambled to my feet and charged at the door, throwing my weight against it in a desperate attempt to escape. With one final push, the door gave way, swinging open and nearly knocking me to the ground. I stumbled into the hallway, heart racing, and dashed toward the staircase. I needed to get out of this place. As I descended the steps, the atmosphere seemed to shift, the air growing colder and heavier with each step I took. The whispers had quieted, replaced by an unsettling silence that felt almost worse. I reached the ground floor, but the lobby was empty. The elderly woman who had checked me in was gone, and the darkness felt thicker than before. I glanced around, searching for a way out. Then, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar, flickering with the light of the street lamps outside. I rushed over, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. The faint sound of laughter echoed from the depths of the hostel, the sound of a party, joyful voices, clinking glasses. It felt like a cruel joke. I turned around, my instincts screaming at me to run, but curiosity compelled me to explore the source of the noise. I followed the sounds to the common area, my heart racing with each step. As I entered, my breath caught in my throat. The room was filled with people, all smiling and chatting, but their faces were blurred, like figures in a dream. "Come join us," one of them called, their voice warm and inviting. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in confusion. Why did they look familiar? It struck me suddenly, the photographs. These were the people from the pictures, the lost travelers, forever trapped in this twisted celebration. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Their smiles turned sinister, their laughter echoing hollowly. "You've finally come to join us," they said in unison, their voices a chilling melody. I turned to run, but the door I had entered through was gone, replaced by a wall of darkness. I was trapped, with nowhere to escape. Panic surged through me as I backed away, only to stumble over something cold and lifeless on the floor. I looked down to see an old suitcase, the initials AM scratched into the side. A wave of horror washed over me as I realized that it must belong to one of the missing travelers. The suitcase was filled with personal belongings, old clothes, a diary, and photographs. I picked up the diary, flipping through its pages. The last entry was dated just days before the group had disappeared. It spoke of strange occurrences in the hostel, a feeling of being watched, and an unsettling sense of dread. My heart sank as I realized that the spirits of the people who had once been alive were still here, trapped in this limbo, and I was about to join them. Panic clawed at my throat as the reality of my situation sank in. I was surrounded by the restless spirits of the past, caught in their eternal revelry. I dropped the diary, my mind racing as I searched for a way out. The figures around me swayed, their faces still obscured but now contorted with a mix of joy and sorrow, beckoning me to join their ghastly gathering. "Why won't you stay?" a voice whispered in my ear, sending chills down my spine. I turned, eyes wide, scanning the room for an escape. The once cheerful atmosphere had become suffocating, the laughter transforming into a mocking chorus that echoed in my mind. I backed away, my heart pounding like a war drum. "No, I won't stay," I shouted, my voice trembling as I turned toward the only exit. What I hoped was still a way out. The shadows twisted and writhed, almost alive, as if trying to ensnare me. I dashed for the wall where the door had once stood, praying it would miraculously reappear. With every step, the spirits reached out, their cold hands grazing my skin like ice. I could feel their desperation, their fear of being forgotten, and it sent me into a frenzy. I slammed my hands against the wall, shouting for the door to open, for freedom. I felt my sanity teetering on the edge. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint creak. The wall shuddered, and in an instant, the door swung open, spilling light into the room. Hope ignited within me. I bolted toward it, ignoring the cold fingers grasping at my clothes. "Let me go! Let me go!" I screamed, the panic fueling my escape. As I burst through the doorway, I stumbled into the cold night air. The moon hung high, illuminating the hostel's facade with a ghostly glow. I ran down the steps and didn't stop until I reached the edge of the property. Glancing back, I saw the silhouettes of the spirits standing at the entrance, their faces twisted in sorrow and longing. "Come back," they whispered, their voices echoing in the wind. But I didn't look back. I turned and sprinted down the darkened road, my heart racing and my lungs burning. The further I got from that haunted place, the lighter I felt, as if a weight had been lifted from my soul. Hours later, I found myself standing in the middle of a bustling city, the noise and lights overwhelming my senses. I was free, but the memory of the hostel haunted me like a shadow, lingering in the corners of my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The spirits of the hostel were real, and they were still waiting for someone to join their eternal party. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something far worse than death. I had narrowly avoided becoming another lost soul in the dark history of the abandoned hostel, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and some spirits are never truly at rest.
The Phantom Hitchhiker.
I've always been a bit of a wanderer. Hitchhiking has been my way of getting from place to place ever since I could remember. There's something about the open road, the uncertainty of the next ride, the freedom that comes with having no set destination. But that night, something felt off. I was somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, on a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. Maybe somewhere in the Arizona desert, or along one of those forgotten highways in California. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading from a dull orange to deep purple. It was getting dark fast, and the wind was picking up, sending dust swirling around me. I hadn't seen a car in hours. My feet ached, and my water bottle was nearly empty. I knew I had to find a ride soon, or I'd be stuck out there all night. Then, finally, I saw it. A pair of headlights in the distance, faint at first, but they grew brighter as the car approached. I stuck out my thumb, hoping they'd stop. My heart pounded a little harder than usual. Maybe it was the isolation, the silence of the empty road. Something just felt wrong. The car slowed, and relief washed over me as it pulled over. It was an older model, a classic car, maybe from the 70s or 80s. I didn't get a good look at the driver as I approached, just the outline of his head in the dim light. He didn't roll down the window or say anything, just leaned over and unlocked the door. I hesitated for a second, that familiar twinge of unease creeping up my spine. But I was too tired, too desperate for a ride to care. I climbed in, and the door clicked shut behind me with a heavy thud. "Thanks for stopping," I said, my voice sounding small in the cramped space of the car. The driver didn't respond, didn't even look at me. He just stared ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The engine growled as he pulled back onto the road. For a while, we drove in silence. I glanced over at him a few times, trying to get a read on the guy, but there was something off about him. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but what I could see was expressionless, almost blank. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just tired or not much of a talker. That's what I told myself, anyway. The road stretched out in front of us, the headlights barely cutting through the thickening darkness. I could feel the tension in the air growing, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It felt like the world outside the car was shrinking, like the road was the only thing left, stretching on and on with no end in sight. I tried to make conversation, to break the awkward silence. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet of the car. He didn't answer at first. For a long moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then, in a low, almost mechanical voice, he muttered, "Just driving." That was it. Nothing else. Just driving. I glanced at the dashboard, noticed there was no GPS, no radio playing, nothing. Just the low hum of the engine and the tires rolling over the asphalt. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The road seemed endless, like we were driving through some forgotten corner of the world where time didn't matter. Every time I looked out the window, it was the same. Dark, empty, no signs of life, no landmarks, just nothing. My stomach tightened with unease. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. There was something off about this ride, about this driver. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake getting into this car. And then, without warning, the driver spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have gotten in." The driver's words, asterisk, "You shouldn't have gotten in," echoed in my head, bouncing around like a warning I couldn't shake off. My throat tightened, but I forced out a nervous laugh. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. He didn't respond. His hand stayed locked on the steering wheel, knuckles pale under the dim dashboard light. His eyes, empty, cold, were fixed straight ahead. The uneasiness that had been nagging me since I got in the car surged into full-blown fear. I glanced at the door, contemplating if I could just open it and roll out, but the road was speeding by too fast, and the desert outside was pitch black. I shifted in my seat, my hand sliding toward the door handle, testing it without making it obvious. Locked. Of course, it was locked. I should have expected that, but when my fingers touched the cold metal, a wave of panic washed over me. The road stretched out endlessly ahead, a long, dark ribbon cutting through the emptiness. There were no lights, no houses, no other cars, just the sound of the engine and the low whine of the wind outside. I was trapped. After what felt like an eternity, the driver finally spoke again, his voice just as low and lifeless as before. "Shortcut." The word sent a chill down my spine. "What shortcut?" I asked, sitting up straighter now, my muscles tensing involuntarily. I didn't remember any turns coming up on the road, nothing that looked like a detour. But as soon as the question left my lips, the car slowed, and he turned the wheel sharply to the right. I hadn't even seen the turn until it was too late. The headlights illuminated a narrow, dirt road that seemed to appear out of nowhere, cutting into a dense thicket of trees. The asphalt gave way to gravel, the tires crunching loudly beneath us as we veered off the main highway. "This isn't on the map," I muttered, more to myself than to him. I glanced at my phone, trying to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The screen showed a spinning wheel of nothingness, taunting me. I held it up higher, trying to catch a bar, but the signal was completely dead. Just my luck. We were now deep into the forest, the trees forming a thick canopy overhead, blocking out what little moonlight there was. It felt like we were descending into a tunnel of darkness, the trees pressing in on either side of the car. The headlights barely cut through the shadows. Everything outside the car seemed off. The trees looked twisted, their branches gnarled like claws reaching for the road. There were no animals, no sounds of life, just the wind and that gnawing silence. I couldn't take it anymore. "Look, man," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence, "this doesn't feel right. Just let me out. I can walk from here." The driver didn't respond. His foot stayed steady on the gas, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. It was like he hadn't even heard me. My heart started racing, my breath coming faster. I tried the door again, yanking at the handle harder this time. Still locked. I pulled out my phone again. No signal, no hope of calling anyone. The panic was settling in now, real and tangible. I said, "Let me out," I shouted, slamming my hand against the window. The sound echoed inside the car, but the driver didn't flinch. It was like I wasn't even there, like I was invisible. As we drove deeper into the woods, the road got narrower, and the trees loomed larger, almost like they were closing in on us. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then stayed on, but dimmer than before. My palms were sweating, my fingers gripping the seat as if that would keep me safe. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a gas station. It looked old, like it had been abandoned for years. But the lights inside were flickering, and there was a single pump outside, rusted and weather-beaten. I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe there was someone there who could help, someone who could get me out of this nightmare. I leaned forward, pointing toward it. "Stop! There's a gas station. Let me out there." But as soon as I said it, the driver veered the car to the left, completely bypassing the station, heading further into the woods. The road was getting worse, bumpier, as if no car had driven down it in years. I could feel every rock, every pothole rattling through the floorboards. I turned to the driver, my fear now boiling over into anger. "What the hell is wrong with you? Why won't you stop?" His head turned slowly toward me, his face now partially illuminated by the dim dashboard light. And that's when I noticed it. His eyes, they weren't right. They were sunken in, dark, like there was nothing behind them. His mouth twitched slightly, forming a smile that didn't belong on a living person's face. "Too late," he whispered. I sat frozen in my seat, my breath caught in my throat. His eyes, those dead, hollow eyes, stared right through me, and that eerie smile sent ice down my spine. There was no warmth, no humanity in his expression. It was as if I was looking at something that had only just learned how to mimic a person. "Too late," he had said, and those words rattled in my mind like a death sentence. I forced my eyes back to the road, trying to shake the terror that was creeping over me like a suffocating blanket. The forest seemed darker, denser, the trees closing in from every direction. The narrow path we were on was barely visible now, just a jagged line of dirt and rocks cutting through the blackness. The car bounced and swerved as the tires struggled to grip the uneven ground. And then I noticed something I couldn't explain. The road ahead, the one we had been driving down, was disappearing. No, not disappearing, fading. The further we went, the more indistinct the edges of the path became, until it was like we were driving into nothing. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was the darkness playing tricks on me. But no. The road was dissolving into the blackness, like smoke in the wind. "Stop the car," I said, my voice trembling. "Stop the car now." But the driver kept going, as if he hadn't heard me. His smile faded, and his face returned to that same blank, emotionless mask. His hands were locked on the wheel, his gaze fixed forward, unblinking. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse thundering in my ears. I had to get out of this car. I lunged for the door again, pulling at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I slammed my fists against the window, the sound barely audible over the grinding hum of the engine. I was trapped, and the driver wasn't stopping. In fact, he was speeding up, the car lurching forward as the wheels kicked up dirt and stones. And then, in the distance, I saw something. At first, I thought it was another gas station, like the one we had passed earlier. But as we got closer, I realized it was no building at all. It was a figure, a person. They stood in the middle of the road, motionless, their back turned to us. They were dressed in what looked like a long, tattered coat, and their hair hung in matted strands down their back. My stomach twisted. What were they doing out here? Why weren't they moving? "Look out!" I shouted, gripping the dashboard. We were heading straight for them, and the driver wasn't slowing down. My voice rose to a frantic pitch. "Stop the car! You're going to hit them!" But the driver's foot pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring as we sped toward the figure. I braced myself for the impact, squeezing my eyes shut just before we collided. But nothing happened. The car passed right through them. I opened my eyes, my body trembling with shock. I whipped my head around to look behind us, but the figure was gone. Just gone. It was like they had never been there at all. I could still feel the cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck, my hands gripping the seat so tightly my knuckles were white. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered under my breath, my mind reeling. I was trapped in this car, on a road that didn't exist, with a driver who wasn't human. I tried to calm myself down, to think rationally, but there was nothing rational about any of this. The car kept moving, the road becoming even more distorted, as if reality itself was unraveling. My mind raced with 100 questions, but one stood out above the rest. Was this even real? Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the car screeched to a halt. I was thrown forward, my seatbelt locking tight against my chest. For a moment, I thought maybe he had finally listened to me, that we were stopping. But when I looked around, I realized we hadn't stopped because of me. We had stopped because the road had ended. In front of us, where the road should have continued, there was nothing but a vast, empty void. The trees on either side of us seemed to stretch into infinity, but the path itself simply ceased. It was like the world had been sliced clean in half, and we were at the edge of that cut. I could feel my breathing quicken, my pulse racing as I stared into the emptiness. It was like looking into an abyss, and something deep inside me screamed that if we kept going, we'd fall into it and never come back. "Where the hell are we?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "What is this place?" For the first time since I had gotten in the car, the driver turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes, those black, soulless eyes, locked onto mine. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "We never left." I recoiled, my mind struggling to process his words. What did he mean, never left? I could feel the walls closing in around me, my sense of reality slipping away with every second. The driver smiled again, wider this time, his teeth gleaming in the faint light. He leaned in closer, his breath cold against my skin. "This is where it begins," he whispered. And then, the engine roared to life again, and the car surged forward, into the void. The car plunged forward, its wheels spinning on the edge of oblivion. My heart pounded against my ribs, my mind reeling from the sheer impossibility of what was happening. I clutched the seatbelt across my chest, as if it would somehow anchor me to reality, but reality itself was slipping away. We were driving into nothing, into pure darkness. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, smothered by the thick, suffocating air that filled the car. I could feel it, like a presence wrapping around me, squeezing tighter and tighter. My breaths became shallow, ragged gasps as I looked around in desperation. The road was gone. The trees, the sky, even the faint outlines of the world I knew, all swallowed by the black void we had entered. The driver didn't say a word. His hands were still locked on the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but I knew he wasn't seeing what I was. He was a part of it, somehow. This place, this nightmare, wasn't new to him. It was him. My pulse pounded louder in my ears. I had to get out. I had to escape this. I fumbled with the seatbelt, my fingers trembling, but the clasp wouldn't budge. I yanked at it, pulling harder, but it was stuck. It was as if the car itself had come alive, trapping me inside, refusing to let me go. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. "I need to get out of here." But the driver remained silent, his face blank, emotionless. He wasn't going to help me. He couldn't help me. I was on my own. Desperation surged through me. I turned toward the passenger door, slamming my fists against the window with everything I had. The glass didn't even crack. I kicked at it, punched it, my knuckles bruising and bleeding, but the car was impenetrable. It was like I was trapped in a coffin, sealed in with something far worse than death. The darkness outside was pressing closer now, wrapping itself around the car like a shroud. I could feel it creeping in, filling the space between us. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was something alive, something watching. I felt its gaze on me, cold and indifferent, as though I was a mere speck in its vast, endless void. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, whispering, so close to my ear that I could feel the breath on my skin. It wasn't coming from the driver. It was coming from the dark. "Why did you come here?" the voice whispered, low and haunting, like a forgotten memory. I whipped my head around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just blackness, endless and terrifying. My throat tightened as the voice spoke again, this time colder, angrier. "You shouldn't be here." I clenched my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms as fear clawed at my chest. I had no idea where we were, what this place was, or how to escape it. My only hope was to keep trying. I slammed my hands against the door again, this time screaming with everything I had. "Let me out!" Suddenly, the car jerked to a stop. The force threw me forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest as the engine cut out with a final, sickening sputter. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, oppressive silence. The kind that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but there was nothing. We were still suspended in the middle of the void, the ground beneath the car invisible, the horizon non-existent. It felt like we had come to rest in the middle of nowhere, and yet I sensed something close. I turned to the driver, hoping, praying, for some kind of explanation. His head was bowed slightly, his hand still gripping the steering wheel as if he hadn't even noticed the car had stopped. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his lips moving, mumbling something too low for me to hear. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. "What's happening? Where are we?" He didn't respond. His lips kept moving, faster now, the words spilling out like a stream of static. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became, and that's when I realized he wasn't speaking in words. He was chanting. A cold wave of dread swept over me. I could barely make out the rhythm, but it was there, repeating over and over in a low, guttural hum. It sounded ancient, wrong, like something that shouldn't be uttered by human tongues. The air grew colder, my breath coming out in shaky puffs as the chant intensified. I backed away, my heart slamming in my chest. "Stop it!" I yelled, but he didn't stop. He kept chanting, his voice rising in volume, filling the space around us with a sound that made my skin crawl. It was as if the darkness was feeding off of it, pulsing in time with his words, growing stronger. And then, without warning, the driver lifted his head. His eyes met mine, those dark, empty pits, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just him. The darkness wasn't just outside the car anymore. It was inside him. I could see it in his eyes, in the hollow of his cheeks, the way his skin seemed to stretch too tight over his bones. He wasn't human. He never had been. His lips parted in a grin that stretched impossibly wide, splitting his face like a gaping wound. "We've arrived," he whispered. The darkness surged forward. Before I could react, it hit me like a tidal wave, cold and suffocating, dragging me down into its depths. I felt it wrap around me, pulling me under, until there was nothing left but blackness. And in that blackness, I heard the voice again. "Welcome home." I can't explain what happened next. It was as if time itself ceased to exist. I was lost in a sea of black, pulled deeper and deeper into an abyss that felt both familiar and alien. The cold wrapped around me like a blanket, suffocating and heavy. I could feel it seeping into my bones, draining away my strength, my will to fight. In the darkness, shadows twisted and turned, shapes forming just beyond my line of sight. I could hear whispers, dozens of voices, all murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. They surrounded me, clawing at my sanity, each syllable laced with an urgency that made my heart race. I wanted to scream, to claw my way back to the surface, but the weight of the darkness was too strong. It pulled me under, deeper into its cold embrace. Then, just when I thought I would lose myself completely, a flash of light pierced the void, a bright, blinding beam that shattered the darkness around me. I felt my body jerk as if it had been yanked from the depths of a nightmare, and suddenly, I was back in the car. The world rushed back into focus, and I gasped for breath, my lungs burning as I took in the stale air. I was still trapped in the vehicle, but something had changed. The driver was gone. In his place sat a figure cloaked in shadow, his features obscured. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't let fear consume me. I had to act. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What did you do to him?" The shadowy figure turned slowly, its movements deliberate and unnerving. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, a heavy weight that settled in my chest. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. This was my chance. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers shaking as I tried to twist it open. The door clicked, and I threw it open with all my might, the sudden rush of wind hitting me like a slap. I jumped out, stumbling onto the road, my feet finding purchase on solid ground. I turned to look back at the car, half expecting to see the driver's twisted grin staring back at me. But the car was empty. I felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. I had escaped, but where was I? The landscape around me was surreal, a twisted reflection of the world I knew. The road stretched endlessly into the horizon, flanked by trees that leaned in unnaturally, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the distant echo of my heartbeat. I turned to run, my instincts screaming at me to get as far away as possible. But as I moved, I noticed something strange. The trees seemed to shift, their shapes morphing into dark figures, their shadows whispering secrets that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the reality of my situation began to set in. I wasn't just running from a nightmare, I was trapped in it. The ground beneath me shifted, the asphalt trembling as if the very earth was alive. I felt a pull, an invisible thread tethering me to the darkness I had escaped. I fought against it, pushing forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, taunting me, wrapping around my mind like a noose. And then I heard it again, the soft chant from before, echoing in the depths of my memory. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. It was as if I could feel the darkness reaching out for me, searching for the cracks in my resolve. I glanced back at the car, still and quiet, and for a brief moment I felt drawn to it. There was something familiar, something that called to me. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "You can't go back. You have to keep going." With a surge of determination, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to escape this twisted reality. Each step felt heavy, the air thickening around me, but I pushed forward. I couldn't let it take me again. I wouldn't let it win. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted, the shadows twisting in the corners of my vision. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the hunger in the silence. But I pressed on, fueled by the desperate need to survive. I had to find a way out. And then, in the distance, I saw a flicker of light, a warm, inviting glow that cut through the darkness like a beacon. Hope surged in my chest, and I ran toward it, the light growing brighter with each step. As I reached the edge of the woods, I burst through the trees and into an open field. The light was blinding now, illuminating everything around me. I stumbled forward, my heart racing, praying that this was real, that I was finally free. But as I stepped into the light, I felt the familiar chill creep back in. The air shifted, the whispers returning, swirling around me like a storm. I looked back toward the woods, dread pooling in my stomach. The shadows moved. They coalesced, forming a shape, a figure emerging from the darkness, its features obscured. It stepped into the light, and I gasped as the truth washed over me. It was the driver. He stood there, a grin splitting his face, eyes glowing with that unnatural light. "Did you really think you could escape?" he called, voice echoing in the stillness. And just like that, I realized I was back where I started, trapped in an endless loop, forever haunted by the specter of my own fears. As the darkness closed in around me once more, I felt my heart sink. I had run, I had fought, but in the end, it didn't matter. I was destined to ride with the ghost, trapped on this twisted road with no escape. I took a deep breath, knowing that I was never truly free. And as I stepped back into the shadows, I felt the car's engine roar to life behind me. The road awaited, and the journey was far from over. This final part wraps up the story with a sense of dread and inevitability, emphasizing the protagonist's struggle against the supernatural forces at play. The looping concept creates a chilling conclusion that leaves the audience with a lingering sense of terror.